Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Marin Coalition's presentation of Where the Money Goes, a breakdown of Measure A. I'm your host, Scott Pinsky, chair of the Marin Coalition. Before we begin, and as you note, we like to get started on time, so thanks for being here. A couple of housekeeping items before we get rolling with our speakers. First of all, this event is being recorded. It will be available for viewing on our website in the archives page in about a day. You can go to marincoalition.org, go to the program archives, and you will see all of our programs there in chronological order for your viewing pleasure. Today's program will be available on closed captioning. You go to the live transcript tab on your bar at the bottom of the Zoom window, I believe is how you access that. We will be taking your questions via the Q&A tab of your Zoom window. So if there is a question you'd like to present to one or all of our panelists, go to the Q&A tab, click on that, type in your question. We will see that and we'll read as many in as we have time for. Let me go ahead and get started then. Today's event, first of all, let me tell you a little about Marin Coalition before we begin. You may or may not know Marin Coalition is an all-volunteer, nonprofit public affairs forum based here in Marin County. We feature speakers with varied perspectives and from all sectors of the community to create what we call conversations that truly matter. And through the end of the season, which runs until June, we will continue to be using the Zoom platform to present our programs to the public at no cost. We thank all of our members and donors who help make these programs possible through your contributions to Marin Coalition, which are tax deductible. Lastly, our next event is May 3rd at noon. We will be presenting another of our previews of elections. This is a preview of the June election, which features our favorite speakers, Dick Spotswood and Greg Brockbank, who will be giving you a wrap up of what's on the ballot in June. And part of that involves today's program, so that will be interesting. Let's jump into it. We're extremely pleased today to have three featured speakers to discuss Measure A. This is the county-wide quarter-cent sales tax that's been approved by the voters of Marin County in 2012. These funds are dedicated to maintaining local parks, open space, and farmland, and since 2013 has supported infrastructure repairs, vegetation management, conservation, and public programs. The program officially sunsetted on March 31, and a renewal measure for revised funding is set for the June ballot. So once again, the next program will have an opportunity to discuss that as part of the election coming up. Let me tell you about our speakers. To begin, we'll have Max Korten. He has been the director and general manager of the Marin County Parks since May of 2016. Marin County Parks is comprised of 34 open space preserves, 4 regional parks, and more than 40 other park facilities across 18,000 acres. Max joined the county in 2014 as a Parks and Open Space Superintendent. Prior to his work at the county, he was the director of the Natural Resources Program and Contracting and at Conservation Corps North Bay. He earned an Environmental Studies degree from UC Santa Cruz and a master's in Natural Resource Science from Humboldt State University. Max will start us out. Before he does, I'm just going to give you the introductions for our other two speakers who will follow him. David Lewis is the director of the University of California Cooperative Extension in Marin County. In this role, he brings research and science-based information to bear on local community needs and issues. He's also a watershed management advisor in the North Bay, where he develops and implements projects that integrate resource conservation with agricultural land use management. David is a retired Peace Corps volunteer, having served in Niger and West Africa from 1990 to 92. He graduated from Carleton College and holds a Master of Science degree in International Agricultural Development from UC Davis. And our other speaker today, Chief Ruben Martin, has been a firefighter in Marin for the past 20 years, working with Marin County Fire, Ross Valley Fire, Larkspur Fire, and now as chief of the Central Marin Fire Department. Throughout his career, he has held the position of firefighter paramedic, engineer paramedic, captain, fire inspector, fire marshal, and fire chief. Chief Martin is currently the president of the Marin County Fire Chiefs Association and the chair of the Advisory Technical Committee of the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority. Quite a panel today, and I'm pleased to begin with Max Korten. Take it away, Max.
Thank you, Scott. Good afternoon. Thanks all of you for joining here to learn more about Measure A, and look forward to giving you information and answering your questions. So let me go to full screen mode here. So this is, if you all have been following Measure A, this may be a bit of a repeat. I'm going to go over just the basics of the measure. Same presentation I gave to the board in February, the Board of Supervisors. And then I'll hand it over to Ruben, who will go over sort of the fire piece of this. And then David Lewis will talk about the ag, sustainable ag. So Measure A was passed in 2012 to support county parks, farmland, and city and town recreation parkland. It got 74% support from voters, and it sunset on March 31st. And so the Board of Supervisors voted in February to put an extension of the measure on the ballot in June. It started with a poll that Marin Open Space Trust did on June 7th of last year that found over 80% support for an extension of the measure. And I'll get into sort of what the process was for looking at the expenditure plan, the ordinance for the extension, and sort of what the changes are. But first, I wanted to talk a little bit about the existing measure and the impact it's had. One thing that's unique about Marin County Parks and Open Space, and the existing measure, 65% of that measure comes to Marin County Parks and Open Space for protecting those lands, improving them, maintaining them. And we did a community survey about 5 years ago and asked folks, what was their top priorities for use of those funds. And what we heard loud and clear was wildfire prevention work, fuels reduction was number one. And Ruben will talk, Chief Martin will talk a little bit about, what that looks like, how it works with Measure C funds. But I just wanted to note the way our open space lands look in the county. They ring the suburban and more developed parts of the county. They're not one big contiguous landmass. And they really encompass a lot of the wildland urban interface. We have over 3,500 homes that back up against open space. And so one of the things that Measure A has allowed us to do, we went from spending about $250,000 a year on fuels reduction to over $2 million a year over the last couple of years. And what it allows us to do is go in and maintain those areas. We still haven't gotten to all the defensible space. And our goal, if we are able to, if voters do extend the measure, is to be able to every year maintain all the defensible space that we manage in partnership with our local fire jurisdictions and the MWPA. The other area of focus when we asked the community, what are your top priorities? They said maintaining and improving our parks. These park facilities, the picture there of that multi-use path, that's the Mill Valley Sausalito multi-use path. It's our most visited feature, and thanks to Measure A and being able to leverage some outside funds as well, we've been able to repave that path for the first time since the 1980s. And that, it's really an example that is similar to a lot of our park facilities that were constructed in the 1970s and 80s and have failing infrastructure. And so, one of our real areas of focus has been, repairing restrooms, repairing paving, doing improvements and repairs to some of our fishing piers on the bay, at Paradise Park, at McNears Park, some much loved places. And of course, there's still quite a bit of work to do to take care of these aging facilities that people really love and cherish. And then trail maintenance and improvements. In our open space preserves, we maintain about 250 miles of fire roads and trails. And Measure A has actually allowed us to go in and make significant improvements before we were sort of putting Band-Aids on the problems that were out there. And so it's been really exciting to see how we've been able to improve that system of fire roads and trails. The other focus that we've had is around equity and reducing barriers to visitation of our parks. What we found, we did a survey with San Francisco State University and found that, a lot of our preserves, the visitors were less diverse than the community at large. And so we looked for ways to break down barriers. One thing that we did with Measure A is we reduced the fees to enter our parks. We created a library pass program so anyone could check out a pass to visit our parks from the library. And it was the second most checked out item in the library in the first year of its introduction. And then we supported community organizations and healthcare organizations to access our parks for healthy exercise. We also, really focus on biodiversity protection, restoration, adapting to sea level rise. We manage a lot of wetlands on the bay and on, Bolinas Lagoon, the ocean side of the county. And so helping restore those wetlands to help adjacent communities and recreational facilities adapt to sea level rise. And then we've been able to acquire land for new parkland with Measure A. And some of those were examples are Bowman Canyon up around Novato or Bucks Landing near San Rafael, both of which were properties that community had been trying to acquire for over 40 years. And thanks to Measure A, we're finally able to do so. Another aspect is preserving farmland, and David Lewis will describe that in much greater detail than I will here. And then, another piece that's really important to mention is 15% of the measure goes to city, town, and special district parks. So, any park in your community is likely supported by Measure A, and projects like replacement of playgrounds or resurfacing of tennis courts shown here have been some of the fruits of that Measure A funding. So, the Board of Supervisors in June asked myself and our team to work towards putting an extension of the measure on the ballot. And so we went through about a 9-month process to get feedback from the community. We put out a survey that got about 5,000 responses. We met with 45 different community groups. We presented to the Board of Supervisors and our commission to get further feedback several times. Eventually came to our commission on January 20th with a recommendation of the ordinance and expenditure plan, and then brought it to our Board of Supervisors twice in February. And again, on the February 15th, the board voted to put this measure on the ballot. So the way that the measure looks, it's very similar to the existing measure. 65% goes to Marin County parks and open space preserves for restoration, maintenance, improvement of the parklands. 20% goes to sustainable agriculture. There's some changes in what that looked like based on the feedback we got from the community. And then 15% goes to cities and town parks. And I'll describe some of the changes here in these next couple of slides. So of the 65% that goes to Marin County parks, 65% of that 65% goes towards maintaining existing facilities, restoration, public engagement, all that kind of work that we do. But there's a new allocation that's really responding to one thing that we heard loud and clear from the community, which was they really wanted us to focus on reducing the risk of wildfire on our preserves. And so we created a new allocation of 25% of the 65% that goes to fuels reduction. And it has to be used for direct implementation of fuels work through fuel reduction crews, and in partnership with the Marin Wildfire Protection Authority. And so, it really sort of, it solidifies something we've been doing already, but it kind of makes it more of the fabric of how we operate, which is to work in partnership with our wildfire agencies to help protect communities by reducing fuels in the wildland-urban interface on our lands. It also reduces the acquisition funding from, it was 20% of the 65% down to 10%. we only used about half of that funding in the initial round. And while there's still some important parkland that the communities are interested in, we think that that is a reduced amount is probably right for this extension. And then the sustainable agriculture piece, again, David will get into more detail with this, but the existing version of the measure, 95% of that 20% went to grants for easements to protect farmland in perpetuity as conservation and agricultural easements. And with this new version of the measure, that 95% will be reduced to 50% of the 20% will be in a grant program to do that for that purpose. Then 20% is in a grant program that goes to the Resource Conservation District for work to do restoration and carbon farming work on working lands. And then the remaining 30% is a new grant program that we really heard a lot of interest in that supports things like community gardens and other ways that communities can connect to healthy foods and working lands. And then lastly, the 15% to cities and towns remains the same. And that was something that we heard strongly that people really, communities really benefited from that funding and wanted to keep it the same. And then this is a graph. This is the same that was shown in the intro video. And you'll notice that it breaks it down 65% for parks and Marin County Parks and Open Space, 20% for sustainable ag, and 15% for cities. And then within that, we've broken down those how the funding breaks down. So if you add it all up, it would add up to 300%. That's just because it's the percentages of the percentages. So hope that it's a little complicated, but I hope it makes sense to folks. And this is looking at the same thing, but broken down in terms of dollars. And this is available on our website. I know I'm going through these relatively quickly. And one thing that was really important that we heard from the community was transparency and accountability and oversight. We have an existing community oversight committee that would continue with the extended measure. There's a 5% cap on administrative costs, and we have a requirement of annual independent financial audits, not only for our department, but also for the subgrantees. And every single year we've had a clean audit for these funds. And we also have annual reports that are available on our website so you can see how the money was spent every year. And that's it. This next slide is actually from my board presentation. So now I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to hand it over to Chief Ruben Martin, again from Central Marin Fire. And he's going to pick it up talking about the fire piece of this.
Perfect. Thank you, Max, and good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about how the fire service partners with Marin County Open Space and the UC Co-op extension on trying to reduce the wildfire risk here within the county. Give me a sec while I share my screen. Can everybody see that okay? Okay, so with the Marin County Fire Chiefs Association, which it includes all of the fire agencies within the county, partner with both Marin County Open Space District and the UC Co-op extension to try to reduce the wildfire risk within the county for everyone. The wildfire risk in the county has existed for hundreds of years prior to the European settling in the area. The biggest thing that has happened over the last several decades is what we're seeing is more and more people starting to move out towards the wilderness areas, which then puts communities at higher risk for wildfires. And some of our partners that own or actually inhabit the wildland urban interface area is our Marin County Open Space District. So it's really important for us as fire agencies to partner with them since they're one of our biggest neighbors. And within the Marin County Fire Chiefs and local fire agencies, our biggest motto is for neighbors to work together to try to reduce that wildfire risk. And as I mentioned earlier, our biggest neighbor within all of our private residences is the Marin County Parks and Open Space District. So we'll move on. So how will Measure A reduce the fire risk for us? In a couple of different manners. One, it provides funding for fuels management. Prior to the 2017 siege of the North Bay, that kind of opened our eyes up to what the real true risk and impacts that fire can have on all of our communities was when the North Bay began to burn in October of 2017. What that did for us is basically in Marin, it educated all of our community members that that similar type of event can happen to us. So with funding with fuels management, Open Space District, as Max, had mentioned earlier, they only had about 250,000+ that they would dedicate to fuels management. Well, what this did, it offered an opportunity for us to join forces together with both Measure C funding, local jurisdictional funding, and county Parks and Open Space Measure A funding to then to try to start to reduce the risk around all of our communities. And part of that is by expanding the existing fuels management program. We've been a partner with County Open Space District for decades. However, a lot of the fuels management in the past was a one-off. We'd get a complaint from one neighbor, and then we'd approach Open Space District, and then we'd try to abate any kind of fuels management around that area. However, we realized that by taking care of one small parcel, it wasn't really reducing the entire risk to the entire community. So we started looking at how can we collaborate and be on the same page, both what Parks and Open Space District mission is on fuels management and what our risk and priorities are within communities that we work in, where we tend to see daily what these, where the target hazards are. Also, it's collaborating with the MWPA member agencies. There's 17 communities, fire districts, special districts that form up the MWPA that was formed in 2020 through the tax measure, Measure C. Another component of how Measure A will help us reduce some of that wildfire risk is habitat restoration. What we want to get back into is by removing a lot of the invasive species, the dead and down, the stuff that has accumulated over the decades, that then tends to increase the fire risk that's out there for us. So habitat restoration is a huge component to us. Then the last component is, as Max mentioned, is maintaining the existing fire road network. And what does the fire road network do? It provides access to these wildland areas for all the fire agencies in the event of a wildfire. And then the other component to it as well is for community members to be able to use that fire road network as trails and hiking places where you can then go and increase your lifestyle and improve it throughout that. So let me get into a little bit about Measure C. So a lot of community members approach us stating, why are we going to have two different tax measures that then address the wildfire risk? So Measure C, prior to the 2017 fires, wasn't even a thought for many communities here in Marin. It was a tax measure that was approved by the voters in 2020. It is a parcel tax. I believe it's about 10 cents per square foot of livable unit that generates approximately $20 million in the county annually, that's then allocated back into the community for actual projects that are being done and for fuels reduction. That 20 million is broken down into three different buckets, so to speak, or areas of responsibility. 60% of the funds are dedicated to core projects. And when we say core projects, is the county was divided up by the fire agencies into 5 different operational areas or geographic areas that could then be managed within emergencies. So within those 5 operational areas, it made sense to then break up the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority within those core areas. And those core areas include Novato, San Rafael, the Central Core, which is the Central Valley or the Ross Valley area, the Southern Marin area, and then the West Marin area. So each area or core section that the county is broken up to, 60% of the funds that are collected through Measure C are then put back into projects that could then benefit the communities within each of those core areas. For example, within Central Marin, what we're doing is the first year of the funds, we used it for evacuation route improvements by fuels reduction and vegetation management along a road, around existing networks throughout the county that would then be used for evacuation routes. 20% of that $20 million is then also allocated for defensible space inspections and or home evaluations within the community. So that's where you'll actually see people going door to door and evaluating each property and advising the homeowners of what you can do as a responsible property owner to try to then reduce the wildfire risk within your own personal parcel. And then the final 20% is allocated for local projects, which then, for example, here within the Central Marin fire jurisdiction, we have both the city of Larkspur and the town of Corte Madera. So 20% of the funds that are collected within each of those communities is then allocated for projects within those communities. And the majority of these projects that we look at is for local abatements, or we look at parcels that can then be abated to reduce that wildfire risk. And what we started utilizing is some of these local project funds were where our biggest risk that we identified were in the surrounding communities around open space district. So that's where we started reaching out to Max and his team to try to figure out how can we best collaborate together to try to get some of these projects off the ground and utilize both our 20% funding plus the funding allocated through Measure A. Then we can expand and make both our dollars go twice as long and try to create these fuel breaks throughout the community. Here's examples of where we partnered. Up on top of Summit Drive in Corte Madera, we're surrounded by open space districts. So this is one of the projects where we did a before and after. You can see in the images of where we went out there and cleared a lot of the dead and down, removed a lot of the dead material within the trees, created kind of what we call a shaded fuel break, which will then allow the firefighters a fighting chance to then try to extinguish the fire as it approaches the community. For us, we also look at this as habitat restoration by removing a lot of the invasive species. Here's another picture of Corte Madera Ridge at the top of Summit Drive, where we abut up against open space district. As you can see on the left-hand side, it's completely covered in Scotch and French broom, which is an invasive species, which then adds a lot of that fuel loading that then allows for embers to land and fires to then get larger and then spread into the surrounding communities. So you can see for us, by doing that habitat restoration and removing a lot of the invasive species, it removes a lot of that dead, low, light, flashy, hazardous fuels that could then transmit fire up into the canopies of the trees. Here's another example where we partnered with Open Space District in another project by utilizing both Measure A funding, Measure C funding, and through grants that we were able to get through CAL FIRE, where we were able to reduce a lot of the invasive acacia forest that was starting to grow in, and removing a lot of the Scotch and French broom. So you can see on the picture on the left, or correction, on the right, on the after, we restored the entire habitat of that area. Small oak trees that were trying to sprout and were struggling with the acacia forest, so now have an opportunity to thrive, which then eventually will turn into that shaded fuel breaks, which then reduces the fuel hazard, which then reduces that risk to the surrounding community. For those of you that may or may not remember, in early 2020, in this exact location, right after we had removed all the fuels, we had a small fire that came through. The fire was contained to less than an acre because we removed the entire fuels that were there prior to the fire happening. However, if we would never have done this type of fuel treatment and partnered with Open Space District, this type of small fire would then have carried into the Open Space District and probably traveled down into West Marin at some point. And then, of course, one of the things that we tend to forget about that Max mentioned with the Measure A funding is they support agricultural lands and the ag community. For us, the ag community has always been a huge partner in fuels reduction. One may not think as livestock as fuel reduction source, but as you can see here, goats are eating all the dead, dry vegetation that's out there, that then reduces the amount of fuel loading that's in a hillside, which will then reduce the amount of fuel that's available to burn. You know, the agricultural community will look at this as opportunities for grazing to keep their livestock healthy. We look at it as a partnership in trying to reduce fuels within areas. You know, for decades I had worked out in, or not decades, for years I had worked out in West Marin, and our partners in the ag community out there played a tremendous role in us trying to reduce the fuels hazard by grazing all of their lands and by maintaining them, which then in reality creates that huge defensible space or a green belt around the built out environment within most of Marin. With that, that is the end of my presentation. I'll transfer it over to David at the UC Co-op, where he can continue. Actually, one more slide here, if I can continue. Here is another example where we're partnering with the Open Space District. Is we're creating what we're calling the Greater Ross Valley Shaded Fuel Break. It's 31 miles that goes from Ring Mountain Open Space Preserve in Corte Madera, and it will encompass every community that it touches, all the way down into Baltimore Canyon, Larkspur, and then actually reach out all the way into Cascade Canyon and Fairfax. What we anticipate is that this work will begin in late of 2022, and it should last anywhere from 3 to 5 years. If it wasn't for the partnership of Marin County Open Space District, I think that this project probably wouldn't be able to get off the ground. One, because it's actually doing work on their property, which we both feel that is a benefit for both the residents of our communities and with the Open Space District, because we can then protect both of our assets and both of our priorities there. With that, that is the end of my presentation, and I'll go ahead and shoot on over.
Thank you, Chief Martin. I'll double check that everyone can hear me well, and I will start a slide deck as well. And ask that you're able to see this. So hopefully that's up and running in my intro slide. And I just want to say thank you to all of you for inviting me to join in this panel and join Chief Martin and Director Korten in this discussion. By way of introduction, I want to just share the mission statement for the University of California Cooperative Extension in Marin County, and really just emphasize that we are that longstanding partner with the County of Marin, bringing the university's research and education mission as a complement to local agencies and organizations and communities to develop solutions and grow the community's capacity to solve problems and address needs. You may know us through our 4-H program, our youth development program, whether it's the community clubs or after school enrichment, where we're making available to youth the opportunity to set goals and learn about civic engagement, grow science literacy skills and confidence, all things that really lead to a more thriving, successful life later after childhood and after youth. You may also know us as the Marin Master Gardeners, wonderful group of volunteers, over 300 strong, that are out in homeowners' gardens, coaching them on efficient and effective water use and plant selection to save water. We do that in partnership with the Marin Water District, Marin Water now. We also have a great group of volunteers, and as Chief Martin mentioned, partnering with the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority to bring the information around defensible space. What can a homeowner do to plan and maintain a garden and a landscape that further enhances that defensible space and meets the objectives for both fuel reduction, but other biodiversity and general garden and watershed management, environmental quality goals. So we in addition to those programs that are probably known by you, we work very closely with Marin's agricultural community, bringing research and education ideas so they can innovate and lead the way in local sustainable food production and soil and water resource management. And I think that's why I'm here today, is just to give you a picture about that and how that relates to Measure A. So kind of start broadly though, here in 2022, and when we think nationally, what is a farmer currently? And undoubtedly, like many sectors across the country, things are changing, but some things are still, the same. Most of who farms today is male, is Caucasian and white, and is generally older, so generally over 57 years of age. Reality across the country and in California, but things are changing. We're really lucky to see a whole new generation of committed agriculturalists joining, either new to it or the next generation of current farm families. Marin is fortunate to have third, fourth, and fifth generation members of family farms and ranches currently operating or getting into the business, specifically taking over. Very much increased interest and support and respect for traditional ecological knowledge in our indigenous groups and their ways of stewarding the land and producing and bringing about food and fiber for sustenance. And increasing appreciation, recognition, and respect also for the employees. It's not just who owns the operation or the land, it's who's harvesting the crops and who's tending the livestock that is a farmer today. And there's the broad food system, whether that's in the local grocery store, the farmer's market, the staff that makes sure those products are available to customers, the individual that's ready with insurance or accounting expertise, maybe capital and loan companies that support agriculture and the food system. So we think more broadly now about who a farmer is in 2022. And they all contribute, and I'll start kind of with California and drill into Marin, but just some perspectives about what farming in California means. California leads the country in many ways in terms of producing the nation's vegetables and dairy products. Really quite phenomenal rate. I'm going to highlight a few things here for you to think about, but quite high rate of organic certification and production of organic goods as well. But across the state, the average net farm income is about $126,000. So that's the net income. And generally, like in California, the vast majority of farms are small family farms, meaning that they gross less than $325,000 to $350,000. That's before costs, the gross. So keep that in mind. When we come to Marin, we have about 340 farms, plus or minus, that are covering about 160,000 acres. And generally, most of those are less than 500, and almost half are less than 50 acres in size. Really interesting point for us in Marin to keep in mind is that really have less than 4% of the land is irrigated. There's just not the right combination of water and soils to support irrigated ag. But there's a great combination of rolling hills and grasslands close to the ocean with a maritime influence, an extended growing season almost relative to other parts of the state. It makes it really ideal for livestock agriculture. And we'll talk about that in a second. Another point though is in Marin, compared to that California average, the net farm income is $56,000, and that's after expenses. That also includes any insurance or government programs that might support farming. And this is a point then to highlight that, again, those small farms that I mentioned nationally in California and here in Marin generally rely upon an off-farm source of income. Someone is working yet another job somewhere else in addition to what the farm is producing to make ends meet. And what we farm here in Marin, I mentioned this already, but We're really leading the way in organic certification. If you remember, I said there's about 160,000 acres total. There's nearly 40,000 acres of that certified organic, and that's really in support of the organic dairies and some other livestock operations as well. But the dairies themselves, to be organic, have to assure that a majority of forage, a high percentage of forage, comes from organically certified fields and pastures. And so therein lies why a lot of the acreage in Marin is certified organic. And then you'll see that combined, there's less than 1,000 acres in any kind of row crops or wine grapes and in nurseries, but they do make up a difference. And I'll explain the difference in terms of diversification for Marin's farm portfolio, if you will. So just keep these numbers in mind. And I'll come back to that point about the diversification here just briefly. But a source for data about Marin County agriculture comes from Marin's Agricultural Weights and Measures Department. This is their annual crop and livestock report. The current report is 2020. The 2021 report will come out in June. What we can do then is go and get the data from these reports and build a sense of what are the trends in production across time for Marin agriculture. And so what you can start to see, and I'll highlight first the blue bar from the bottom up represents livestock products. That's really your dairy products, your cheese, your milk. And really early on from 1942 to 52 on through to about 1992, 60–70% of what Marin was producing was livestock, was dairy products. But starting in about 2002 and going into 2012, you start to see a change where livestock and poultry, this is now your meat, your wool, your eggs, really starts to take a larger percentage. Similarly, field and orchard crops take a larger percentage, they increase. And we do see increases in the acreage in field and orchard crops at that time. We also see an increase in things like pasture poultry raising take hold. And it really centers around a combined effort to help teach about diversification and value-added production, get people connected, get these farms and ranches connected to farmers markets and selling directly to customers. Notice too that the black here, the shellfish production, that figure's large, or it does contribute a percentage to Marin's overall production. So with that background, I'm gonna build upon some points that Chief Martin made there about fire, that it's a shared goal across the agricultural, the open space, and even into our residential parts of the landscape. There's an equal shared goal in climate management across those three parts of the landscape. And this has to do with really comes out through the climate action plan that Marin County passed in December of 2020. That climate action plan is first and foremost an inventory of emissions and then a plan to reduce those emissions. And when you combine both the unincorporated and the incorporated sources of greenhouse gases, agriculture contributes about 9%. That's in line with estimates for California and for the nation, where agriculture generally contributes about 5% of greenhouse gas emissions on an annual basis. Note that transportation is well over 50%, and residential energy use, when combined with transportation, takes you up above 70% of the emissions. But it's this 9% emissions, and then the goal setting around that I want to spend a little time sharing with you. First and foremost, the climate action plan targets the reduction of those emissions to levels below 1990 by 40%, of 40% by the year 2030. And that work will be important and is critical if we're going to be successful. We need to first achieve this locally, and then in conjunction and cumulatively across multiple counties be successful on up to a global scale. But what's unique in the Marin Climate Action Plan is a precedent-setting agricultural chapter, a chapter that looks deep and hard at the sequestration opportunities on those 160,000 acres. And it sets a goal to realize that opportunity so that we can go beyond just emissions reductions to moving closer to carbon neutral, or even carbon negative, by working on those lands to bring practices that sequester carbon. How does that happen? It happens through the Marin Carbon Project. a collaboration of these organizations, local agricultural support organizations that combine their capacities and mission to realize that, to go and do first proof of concept research to confirm what practices do achieve this goal, and then to scale up. And that effort is manifested through individual carbon farm plans. Each ranch that participates in this effort has its own unique plan developed that identifies practices like anaerobic digestion or windbreaks, these orange lines here, and gives the rancher the places and the locations to do that work, and then works on finding the funds to implement the practices and go through the permitting required to do these kinds of projects. Other practices that are involved include the application of compost to rangelands. Those create a direct positive feedback loop and increase the soil organic matter that increases the water holding capacity of the soils. And then that increases the grass growing, the amount of roots that then are released back into the soil. And basically through one application of compost, we can increase the amount of water that can be held annually in soil to about 30,000 gallons per acre. That's a benefit to the farmer. They get more forage, but it keeps this positive feedback going where more and more organic matter is stored in the soil. That's a sequestration feedback loop. Similarly, restoring streams and riparian areas, getting willows and alders to grow along these streams, and then also to trap and secure the soil and litter can also sequester carbon. Research has confirmed that if I just take 2 steps along this creek, and the restoration project's about 20 years old, the carbon in those restored willows and in the stream banks across those 2 just strides I take equals the amount of greenhouse gases emitted by 1 normal passenger car in a year. So every 2 steps of a restored stream is basically taking a car for a year off the road. And to kind of now get to Measure A and how that relates directly to the climate action shared goal, the fire fuels management shared goal that Chief Martin mentioned. The Marin Resource Conservation District is the lead partner in implementing those practices and securing the funding and working through the permitting. This is directly from their website. I'll let you read through these, but the point is that they use those funds to match as matching grants. They use Measure A funds as matching grants to then go pursue other funds, be they state or federal, Coastal Conservancy, currently entertaining and pursuing USDA funding to scale up that work and achieve those shared goals for the landscape. And they plan for future use of Measure A in the same way. So one part of the Sustainable Ag program is this work, this scaling up and achieving those shared goals. Another part relates to changes in the landscape, some that have already happened and some that we hope we can continue to prevent from happening. And namely, it's around development. How and where can we protect the landscape from development, and where is that a priority for us? This is a picture of Novato in what was thought to be one of the first county fairs. And this was taken in circa 1920, I think it's actually 23. This is the same spot today. The town of Novato has grown since then and is urban residential. But some places don't change. And here, this is the Thompson brothers ranch and farm, a dairy and a farmstead cheese production. And today it is the home of Marin French. And so this is a site that's been the longest farmstead production of dairy and cheese in the country since about, I think, 1887. And again, the tool, one of the parts of the Sustainable Ag program is land preservation, the protection against development that organizations like MALT is a lead for and has been a lead since 1980. Roughly 54,000 acres have been permanently taken out of consideration for development through the conservation easements for those properties. And those easements are there in perpetuity. They go along with the title and the deed of the property regardless of the ownership. Again, a few facts and figures from the MALT website about past uses of Measure A for you to look at. And I'll just let you know that they indeed have a queue currently of at least 5 other ranches considering an easement of totaling more than 6,000 acres. So there's a demand and a need to protect this land, and a queue for what MALT and other land conservation, land easement organizations do. The third element inside the Sustainable Ag program, as Max mentioned, is about broader urban and other opportunities to support the food system, from community gardens to access for others that don't have access yet to farm, access to land, access to local healthy food. And so just wanted to really highlight that for a minute. If you want to learn more about Marin's community gardens, here's a resource for you. It's part of Marin County Open Data. There are over 120 community gardens currently, and they all have waiting lists. They all have people that would like to get involved. So it's just one example of how that third element in that Sustainable Ag program is designed to meet the food system, a sustainable food system need and purpose. And if you want to read more about community gardens, this is a resource that we have published on our website. It's got case studies and just nice vignettes and examples of the people and places where this kind of local urban food system is happening across Marin County. I think with that, I will end my show if I can. Here we go. And I will stop share and say, please to Scott, I appreciate this opportunity. Max, Chief Martin, it was a pleasure to follow you.
All right. Well, gosh, the thanks goes to the three of you for such amazing presentations. These are so data-filled and dense and well organized and presented. I just want to remind people this entire presentation is being recorded. It will be available on the website, usually within about 24 hours of the close of the program. And in that way, you can go back to any part of this program that you would like, look at the slides, really digest it in a way that that you have more time to do. This was tremendously informative. Let me jump to the questions, and we have a number of them already. First of all, Max, a question for you from one of our listeners. There are people who object to some of the allocations in the proposed Measure A who are suggesting that if it is defeated in June, you could rewrite the measure and put it on the ballot in November in a different form. Could you please address that possibility? And then also just a general question, I guess, to any of or all of you, if the measure does not pass in June, what are your thoughts as far as next steps? I'll let you take it away, Max.
Thanks, Scott. Yeah, it's a great question. So yeah, it took us, sort of showing that timeline of how we created our expenditure plan ordinance to put on the measure on the ballot. That took about 9 months. And that followed, a couple of years of planning work with the Board of Supervisors and our county administrator and others. I think if the measure was not extended, if voters didn't approve it in June, I think you'd have about a month and a half maybe to put a measure on the ballot. And it seems super unlikely to me, or not feasible, that you could do that in that length of time. That seems very unlikely. It's a very unusual budget process for us this year because we sort of have to plan two ways. One way, if it gets extended, how to continue our services. And then the other way is if the measure's not extended, it's about a third of our funding. So we have to go through the process of laying off, most of our seasonal park aides and maintenance workers, about a third of our open space rangers, almost all of our biologists or trail crew. It would have a huge impact, in addition to all the contractors who do, fuels reduction work and maintenance work for us. It would certainly result in, reduced services and reduced ability to do the kinds of projects we described today.
Chief Martin and David, any thoughts on what would be the result if this does not get approved by the voters in June?
Yeah, on the fire side, as Director Corton mentioned earlier, it's a little over $2 million that goes towards fuels reduction. Right now, what we would have to do is go back to the drawing board, and a lot of these projects that were in the planning phases will have to go back and get reevaluated on priority for funding. One of the things that we have to remember is with Measure C funding, even though it's $20 million allocated annually, it was primarily designated to protect the built environment, meaning homes, defensible space within the community. It wasn't really never intended to go out and maintain parks and open space district and the wildlands that exist. So we would have to go back and re-look at what our financing and budget would look like, and then try to find traditional sources that we did for funding, which was grant allocations, which is a finite number of one-time allocations for projects. And then the other component of it that Parks and Open Space does that we kind of touched on earlier was the fire road network. Is what happens to maintaining the fire roads. Do then they become overgrown to the point where then it becomes inaccessible for firefighters to get out into these rural areas to try to contain and mitigate any kind of these hazards. And some of the things that we look at aside from fire safety is we use a lot of these roadway networks to go out and render aid to any of those sick and injured hikers, travelers, visitors that come out to the county on an annual basis. So it's more than just fire reduction and maintaining these roadway networks. So I think it'd be a huge impact that where we'd have to actually go back and look at what our priorities are within fire mitigation and emergency management.
Any thoughts, David?
Yeah, I really want to emphasize these shared goals we have across these different parts of the landscape. And Measure A, at least from the way I see it and what I've talked to my partners on, will help scale up and achieve those, whether that's a fuels reduction and at the same time a carbon sequestration and a habitat protection role. And without Measure A, there'll be a stalling, maybe even a halting to achieving those goals. Doesn't mean these organizations and partners are going to wait. And we're currently always trying to scale up. That's why we participated in the climate action plan and really took time to write that agricultural chapter in the way that it's written with a careful analysis. But we're at a point where with 20 carbon farm plans written, we can really scale up with the right kind of support. And so we are going to look to scale up one way or the other, and Measure A could be part of that and really welcomed as part of that.
Okay, thank you for that. Let me move on to another question from one of our viewers. I don't see a funding breakdown for signage and enforcement in preserves. The sensitive areas are being overrun by bicycles, specifically night riding in NSO nesting zones, and illegally riding in 86% of foot trails in a legacy zone preserve. The protecting and restoring of the natural habitat should be paramount. And although we have been asking for protection in these areas, we have not seen a lot of action. Some pretty specific contentions there. Any thoughts from any of you?
Sure, well, I can follow up on it. I mean, I think it sounds like what the person is asking about is, how do Measure A funds fund our open space rangers and contract deputies who, do visitor contacts and enforcement in our preserves. And so we have doing that visitor contact work. We have, I can't remember the total number of rangers. It's around 11 open space rangers. About a third of those are funded by Measure A. And then we have 2 contract deputies. Both of them are funded by Measure A. So those are the folks that interact, provide education, enforcement. They also do search and rescue. They, if a tree falls down across a trail, they address the tree, cut it, help move it out of the way. If there's a sign that needs to be replaced or a gate that needs to be open, when there's red flag days, they go out to put out notices and do all those really important things that help keep our visitors safe and keep our preserves accessible. So Measure has a pretty significant impact on our ability to provide those services for the community.
Any other thoughts from the panel on the issue of protecting safety in these areas?
I think it's huge. I think the amount of resources that gets sucked into a medical aid, or especially a search and rescue if it's a bicyclist at night, and it just makes that search and rescue that much more difficult, especially if they're going off trail and into remote locations where we normally wouldn't see the riders. It just becomes more and more dangerous for our visitors. So we need to do whatever we can to try to support it and protect and provide anything we can do.
Scott, I mentioned one other thing, which has been really sort of an exciting success story for us has been, our open space preserves, all the trails and fire roads in them, almost all of them were initially built as ranch roads or logging roads. They weren't really built with recreation in mind or access in mind. And what we've been able to do is address those fire roads and trails where they're causing a lot of erosion and where, we had a lot of off-trail use or inconsistent use that sort of caused safety or other issues to other visitors. We've been able to actually address that with Measure A in some really cool ways that help provide improved accessibility, improved safety, at the same time reduce environmental impacts to the preserves. So I think that's been one of the really neat outcomes that, sadly we lose if we didn't have this funding to be able to make those improvements.
Okay, let me move on. We have a question for Chief Martin regarding defensible space inspections. Does the inspector contact the property owner rather than go door to door, where the occupant could be a tenant who would not be responsible for recommended actions? It's a good question.
Yeah, very good question. So we tend to run into this quite a bit where it is a tenant or a leasee versus the property owner. Unfortunately, the inspectors, when they're out in the field, they don't have the data available for whether it is a tenant or property owner. So we make the assumption that anyone living at a location is a responsible party, and recommendations will be made right there when we go door to door, unless we're advised that it is that they're tenants and their responsibility would be on the landowner. And then at that point, we would say one of two things. We could either have the tenant forward the report to them or give us a contact information for the property owner. And then we would then notice the property owner. But at the end of the day, it's the fire department's results oriented. For us, we don't care if it's the tenant or the landowner that does the work. For us, we just want the work done. We just want your property to be maintained for two reasons. One, it reduces the fire risk for your property, for you to possibly lose the investment that you have in that building. And then secondfold, it provides a safe working area for firefighters to, when they show up and there is an approaching wildfire, it gives us an opportunity to have that safety zone around us to where we can then put on a good fight, so to speak, to try to defend your property. So at the end of the day, we'll work with property owners. However, we don't really care who takes care of the work, but we definitely will work with you.
Okay, we have a question from Alan Shevitz here. What Measure A funds, if any, are available for grants to private property owners, I'm assuming, to support Measure A goals? So it kind of ties into what you were just saying. But there could be grants from any agency, so I'm not assuming this is just a fire issue.
Yeah, I'm not sure. So there are a few grant programs. So one is grants to cities, towns, and special districts, not to private individuals, for park facilities. That's 15% of the measure. The grant funds for on the sustainable agriculture piece, they can fund the purchase of easements to protect. So 50% of that 20%, so overall 10% of the measure, can fund the purchase of easements to protect farmland and conservation easements in perpetuity. And so that portion would go, towards purchasing that easement, the the money would go to the property owner and it would secure that easement. It has to be matched 1-to-1 with outside funding as well. And then there'd be the grant program that funds things like community gardens. I don't think that would go to individuals, if that was the question. And then there's a very small program that we administer in Marin County Parks that's funded by Measure A that funds access for disadvantaged communities. It's typically been about $100,000 a year to fund access, and it typically supports transportation for community organizations, not individuals.
Any other funding programs that the other two of you would like to talk about? I know, Chief Martin, there are some fire program grants that are available through certain of the organizations that are out there. I'm familiar with Firewise, and we're starting to hear about grant availability through that program as well. So I don't know if any of this ties into Measure A or not, but feel free to jump in.
Yeah, the fire funding and grants that are out there aren't tied into Measure A. Where we secure grants to try to do fuels reduction, and I look at it as a larger scale, is a lot of the fire prevention grants that are available through CAL FIRE. And that's where we're able to partner with county open space, where they'll be able to provide the biologists to try to do some of the environmental reports for us, some of the bird nesting stuff that we need to do to try to be able to accomplish the work. So that's kind of our partnership there. For individual homeowners and communities, when you start looking at grant funding, there's through the Fire Safe Council, which promotes the Firewise communities. And then if you would go on to your Measure C, which is a completely different tax measure, they provide some grant funding for community members, but nothing necessarily tied into Measure A.
Okay, we have a question from Jim Casper. If the measure is passed in June, on which property tax bill will the assessment appear? For example, on the 2022-2023 bill or something else? Not sure if anybody knows the exact.
Yes, so it's not a property tax; it's a sales tax. And, that was something. I didn't work for the county in 2012 when this was initially passed, but my understanding is that the idea behind that was that not only are our county parks and open space preserves enjoyed by our residents, but they're also really enjoyed by people throughout the region. And so I think there was an idea of making sure that our visitors also help pay their share to fund our parks. And so, a sales tax is something that not only do residents pay, but visitors who come to this area pay as well. So I think that's how the folks in 2012 arrived at the idea of a sales tax.
Got it. So you won't see it on your tax bill for your house. Grace Garrity has an interesting question. I don't understand why fire protection and mitigation, as well as road maintenance, are not part of annual budget of these agencies and has to be included in Measure A. I've managed major budgets in large organizations, and that's just a standard operating expense. Any thoughts as to why this is segregated out into a separate tax measure?
Yeah, maybe I can answer this, and Ruben from a fire perspective may want to add on. But I'd say one thing that's I work a lot with the other park directors and managers around the Bay Area, and pretty much every county in the Bay Area has a special measure to fund and support parks, and part of that is that we're in Marin County and in other sort of suburban Bay Area counties, we're slow growth counties, so there's not a huge growth in development of homes or business. And if you visit other parts of the state or other parts of the country, you'll find amazing park and recreation facilities, and those are often funded in part with hand in hand with the new developments and business and other kinds of funding sources that we just don't have in Marin County because we've been sort of a slow growth county that hasn't had a lot of new development. And so, near pretty much all of the local Bay Area counties have a special measure to help fund these things that are really important to our community. For Marin County Parks, our total budget, including these Measure A pass-through programs to the cities and towns, is about $28 million. And we only get about 2.5 million from the general fund. The remaining comes from fee revenue, lease revenue on our facilities. And then additionally, in 1972, voters passed a different Measure A that funded our open space preserves. And while that funding, has stayed relatively small, it's about $6 or $7 million. And that really supports our core staff that help to operate the open space preserves.
And to speak on the fire side, when you think about it, is your fire departments, fire districts were never designed for fuels management. They were all designed for emergency management and emergency response. So basically, a fire starts, we respond, we mitigate it, we extinguish it. Medical aid happens. We go out, help the sick and injured. If a hazardous material spills, we tend to go out and mitigate those emergencies. We were never really designed for big fuels management, fuels reduction projects. That's why we've gone out to the voters to try to allocate additional funding for these special projects and these special programs. Hence Measure C, hence the increase in funding in Measure A for fuels management and fire mitigation, just because we're starting to see is that the demand on your local emergency services for different mitigation efforts is starting to expand. So we're actually going into the realm of vegetation management, which is typically the responsibility of either a homeowner, property owner, or a landowner. And that's done through different measures, either through manual removal, livestock used for grazing. In the past, fire departments have partnered with both agricultural large landowners and or parks and open space districts to do fuels mitigation by doing prescribed burning. So we got to start getting back into that. However, just to get back to answering the question, is we were never really designed for fuels management or road maintenance.
Okay, we're running to the end, and I want to just have one or two more questions here before we wrap it up. One of the viewers today has observed that we're hearing a lot in favor of Measure A and the benefits of extending this tax. There has not been a tremendous amount said about the contra position that, gee, we don't need this tax, or it's already come and gone. Why do we have to continue it? Or maybe it's too expensive. What are the criticisms, if any, or the opposition that any of the three of you have been hearing over the course of the last, say, few years even, as to reasons why this is not a good idea to have this tax and why it's not a good idea to extend it? Is there any particular viewpoint that you've been hearing, and if so, how would you respond to that? Anybody?
Max?
I mean, yeah, it's a great question. And of course, we heard a lot of feedback in the process of developing the ordinance and expenditure plan. And, I think really tried to, I mentioned those changes in the measure. I think, we heard a critique of like, hey, there should be more for fuels reduction in this measure, and it should be explicit. And additionally, the partnership with our local fire jurisdictions through the Wildfire Protection Authority should be written into the measure. And so that's something, we explicitly did to try to address some of those concerns. And I think, I really heard a lot of, support for how that was, that we were able to achieve that. Although I'm sure there's others who might wish that we were able to do more, and I think that's really understandable. And then, on the agriculture piece, I think we also heard from some folks that were, either didn't think the agricultural piece wasn't as important or didn't like the supporting agriculture through this program. And of course, Board of Supervisors is the body that ended up voting on the expenditure plan and giving feedback. And what I heard from the Board of Supervisors really was when we brought the expenditure plan for the 2 hearings back in February was that they wanted to continue to include that agriculture piece because what we have in West Marin is this amazing sort of cutting edge organic, if not all organic, but very sort of sustainable agriculture so close to the urban Bay Area is something really unique. And that that didn't happen by accident. It really happened because the community here decided to support that and make sure that we had this agriculture that reflected the community's values, and that the Board of Supervisors wanted to still include that. Of course, the measure 80% of it is all about parks and open space, but they wanted to continue to include that 20%.
Scott, if I can add, I think and Max has been really wonderful at leading this conversation as well. This is a regressive tax, right? And equity is so important in today's world. And so how the current version addresses access opportunities for all of Marin's communities to participate and to be even participating in the funds themselves, but also in the outcomes and benefiting from the outcomes, I think has been another way to address one of the concerns, one of the constraints of the first round of Measure A.
Interesting point. Any last thoughts, Chief Martin?
I really haven't heard any negative feedback regarding this tax measure. And it's something to remember, it's not a new tax. It's just continuing an existing tax. And then to be able to continue the collaboration that we've had with both our agricultural community and our parks and open space partners, to continue to have this thriving community that we've built. And like David said, it didn't happen by accident. And what Mark had said also, Max had said also, the citizens of Marin understand what jewel that they have here within the county. And what we need to do is to try to continue that and to try to continue to support all of our neighbors and to provide that equal access to everything for everyone.
Well, I can't think of a better observation to end on. So we're going to have to wrap it up here. Let me thank our 3 presenters for just a terrific and very thorough discussion of this issue. You can find it again on our website, probably tomorrow. It'll be in the recorded section. Thank you all again for a terrific day here. I want to thank everyone for listening. Thank Pat Randolph for putting this program together. And also a thanks to Mimi Willard of COST for helping us to publicize this presentation. And as always, thanks to our webmaster and technical guru, Alan Shavitz, for another brilliant presentation. Lastly, don't forget May 4 at noon, our next program on the June election preview and commentary by our stellar team of Greg Brockbank and Dick Spotswood. And with that, we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you for tuning in and have a good rest of the day. Thanks very much.